On the motion of the majority leader that this House adjourn, sign it aye. All those in favor of the motion will say aye. Those opposed will say no. This House is adjourned. Sign it aye.
And with the fall of the gavels, just a few minutes after midnight last night, the 2012 session of the Georgia General Assembly comes to a close. It was a session branded by social contention. Women's rights versus fetus rights. Should illegal immigrants be banned from Georgia's colleges? Should the state have the power to charter schools outside of local school districts? Much of that was decided before last night's session ended. And we've got that story and the special legislative wrap-up edition of Primetime Lawmakers. Welcome to the final edition of Primetime Lawmakers for 2012. I'm Scott Slade. Just a few moments ago, you saw the Georgia General Assembly session ended just after midnight last night. The ceremonial banging of gavels, the shouts of sine die, torn up bills, and resolutions flying into the air. It was a joyful end that belied much fighting over controversial issues, and perhaps a great deal of bipartisanship, too, as other measures received swift passage. We'll get into that all as we wrap things up here with an extended version of our Journalist Roundtable this evening. I'm joined tonight live in studio by Tom Crawford, editor of the Georgia Report. Tom has been covering state government for over 30 years and is a frequent contributor to Primetime Lawmakers. Jim Galloway is here. Jim is the AJC's political insider. He's been covering Georgia politics for more than 3 decades. Jim also appears on our show often. Sandra Parrish, you know her well as Primetime Lawmakers Capitol correspondent. Sandra's also a reporter for WSB Radio in Atlanta with over 20 years of experience. And Errin Haines. Errin's a reporter for the Associated Press based in Atlanta. She's been reporting in Georgia for 7 years and occasionally appears on our program. Thank you all so much for being here and being part of Primetime Lawmakers all season long. Well, did everyone get more than 90 minutes sleep last night?
We're all groggy.
Yeah, we're all got a little touch. So the good thing is we're going to say exactly the first thing that comes to mind, right? This is going to be a great half hour. And one issue decided in the waning hours last night was the measure that will limit abortions in Georgia to 20 weeks gestation. The conference committee reached an agreement on including a medically futile exception to the bill. Now, the bill was thought dead by many at the Capitol until yesterday evening. Here's House Speaker David Ralston on Tuesday.
I wouldn't say it's dead, but we're going to need to see a real indication from the Senate that they're willing to engage in a meaningful way.
What we have put in place here today stops all the convenience abortions at 20 weeks, and it also provides the medically futile pregnancies can still be aborted past 20 weeks for those very, very tragic cases. I worked hard with some other folks and really tightened up the language to make sure that it said what the Senate wanted it to say.
Well, yesterday's late compromise and final passage surprised a lot of people. And Tom Crawford, you've been down there for many years seeing all kinds of things come and go. I mean, there were fights going on in front of the cameras, behind the scenes, in the hallways.
This was the most intense and emotional bill that came up the whole session, no question about it. And it got to the point where there was a scuffle between a couple of lobbyists in the hallways. In both the House and the Senate, the women members who felt like they didn't have enough of a say in the debate walked out carrying yellow crime scene tape, yelling and shouting in the halls. It was just a very, very, very emotional cauldron there.
In fact, we do have some of that tape right now. You see some of the Democratic female senators now walking around with the crime scene tape in the Senate chamber. Jim Galloway, it's almost a wonder this thing got decided.
Yeah, it was caught up in some very, very sophisticated game playing between the Senate and the House. The Senate normally has become the more socially conservative body and usually sends very tough legislation to the House, which is then forced to deal with it. This time it was the opposite. The House served the Senate a very, very tough bill with no exceptions. There was no rape or incest exception. I don't think there still is none. Mm-hmm. And even if a woman was carrying a baby that she knew would not be viable outside the womb, she was out of luck when it came to abortion. And finally, the Senate was the one who blinked on this. 13 GOP senators said, no, we need to have that medically viable, medically futile exception. Mm-hmm. And then, I think what happened was that House Speaker David Ralston wanted to enjoy that irony for at least a little while and make both anti-abortion supporters and the Senate sweat a little bit on that.
Errin Haines, you covered the story as well, and people need to remember, even though there were an awful lot of complaints from women senators on this, there were women involved in the conference committee that came up with an deal, were there not? Absolutely.
There were 2 women that were involved. Senator Renee Unterman, the Senate's lone Republican woman, and also Representative Donna Sheldon was involved on the House side. Both, obviously pro-life supporters, and Senator Unterman actually involved in the Women's, Right to Know Act, and so, their involvement in it, they were one of the few, who were not actually, as angry as we saw those Democratic women, opposed out there with the crime scene tape, feeling like their voice really had not been heard in this debate. But ultimately, as Jim said, the House ended up having to make that exception for a child that would, as the bill sponsor said, die tragically and very quickly after being born anyway.
Sandra Parrish, of all the controversial things that didn't get called up, were you surprised that this one did? The idea of restricting late-term abortions did get called up by the Speaker.
Well, considering that Tuesday everyone thought it was dead after Speaker Ralston said he would not form the conference committee, I think people came back on Thursday not really expecting it to come up. There were so many other controversial bills that they had to get through, and I think we were all a little surprised by late afternoon when they did call that. And it's funny, when the women did march out of the Senate, they were shouting, "Women will remember" in November. That was kind of the theme that you heard throughout the Capitol late last night.
Another controversial measure that came before the General Assembly this year was the requirement requiring recipients of public benefits like food stamps, now known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, and what is generally referred to as welfare, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families for TANF program. Having to take drug tests for that, Jim Galloway. For some, a lot of people think that's going to have a Fourth Amendment problem one day.
A similar bill was passed in Florida. It's already been enjoined. This one was made slightly kinder in that it doesn't require urine samples. It takes a sample by swabbing. But I think you can expect a lawsuit to be filed as soon as the governor signs it and as soon as it goes into effect.
Did this one, Errin, wind up getting through a little easier than the abortion bill?
Well, no, and in fact, if the abortion controversy highlighted the war on women, so-called war on women, bills like the welfare drug testing highlighted what some people like to call a war on the poor that was happening in the state this year. There were a couple other bills that people felt like were unfair to the state's poor, especially with unemployment being as high as it is. If people are having a hard time, the last thing they need is to have to, go and be drug tested before they can get much needed benefits.
But Sandra, the argument from some of the Republican leadership was, hey, if you can afford drugs, you can afford to buy food.
Right, and I think some of those who were opposed to the bill, some of the opponents have come out saying, well, matter of fact, if you look at Florida, only 2% of those who were actually tested showed that they had drugs in their system. So they were saying that really wasn't, the driving factor behind that. We talked to Speaker Ralston last night. He said that he does think that it's going to be it will hold up to any constitutional challenge.
Tom?
Well, I think the point they were making was, as Sandra said, a very small percentage are found to actually be using drugs. Plus, the applicant is the one who has to pay for the expense of having the drug test, and these are folks who don't have a lot of disposable income in the first place. So, again, some questions raised about the fairness of it.
The Unemployment Trust Fund in Georgia is over $700 million in debt to the federal government. Legislation that hopes to address the solvency of the fund passed on sine die after a conference committee hammered out the details. The bill increases the amount taxed for unemployment. That's a cost businesses will have to bear. One measure that was struck completely for the bill was a proposed 1-week waiting period for benefits. Now, currently, the unemployed can collect 26 weeks of benefits. The bill will cut that to as little as 14 weeks, although the original legislation called for as few as 12. The bill mandates that the number of weeks be determined on a sliding scale based on the unemployment rate. A complicated formula, Errin, but it sounds like that the folks who are without a job will carry a lot of this weight.
Absolutely. It was certainly a politically unpopular choice, but one that supporters said was necessary because our unemployment trust fund debt is so massive. Currently, the state owes about $760 million back to the federal government. And there was just no clear answer as to how that was going to get paid back and paid back quickly as the economy recovers and the state needs to be economically competitive, quite frankly, with its neighbors if we want to attract jobs back. So yes, while the unemployed are going to carry a lot of that burden because they will, receive fewer benefits, they didn't really see any alternative and felt like they needed to act now.
Mm-hmm. We've got a little tape right here on the discussion that took place before passage. Let's take a look at that.
The sliding scale model where the unemployment rate statewide would adjust the number of maximum weeks available has been cut at the bottom. In other words, where we went from 12 weeks up to 20 weeks, this proposal goes from 14 weeks up to 20 weeks. To be at 14 weeks, we would have to be at a statewide 6.5% unemployment rate. To be at 20 weeks, we have to be a 9 or above, and then it's staggered at 0.5 increments in between there. I think that the sliding scale will return us to solvency faster than we would otherwise, and the only way we realize those savings is when our unemployment rate is down, and I, for one, will welcome the day when our unemployment rate is down.
Certainly we all will. Jim Galloway?
The irony of this, of course, is that $760 million deficit or borrowing was caused by several years of tax holidays granted under the Barnes administration, the Perdue administration, and the Deal administration to businesses with lowered unemployment benefit premiums. And according to the opponents of this, the cost will be unemployed workers will be picking up 2/3 of the cost.
Two-thirds of the cost, Tom.
It's also hidden in there, which nobody talked about, is what amounts to a fairly substantial tax break for businesses. Very quickly, the law has provided for years that when the trust fund gets in this kind of shape, businesses also have to pay a 100% surcharge on the premiums to try to get the fund fiscally sound again. This bill knocks that down from 100% to a 50% surcharge, which could save businesses as much as $300 to $600 million. That didn't come up in debate, but that was a feature of the bill that a lot of people didn't notice.
If there's one thing everybody agrees on, is that Georgia's K-12 education needs some help. Buddy Darden said it last night on our air. What is much harder to reach agreement on is how to do it, and whether or not to allow the state to charter special schools not controlled by local school districts was a common theme running throughout the session. The debate culminated in the passage of a constitutional amendment to ask voters to decide the issue. That'll be on the November ballot. Companion legislation to put how the state's charter schools would operate and be funded was given final passage yesterday. It was one of those last-minute things. That measure includes the provision that no public schools money will be used to fund state charter schools. And Sandra Parrish convincing local governments that they won't take a financial hit on this, was that key to passing the charter schools?
That was key. That was key, and that was the pushback you had seen all along, was that the local governments did not want to see any of their funding go to these charter schools that they had not approved. So they were able to work that out. I think the Association of County Commissioners were happy with how they finally came up with an agreement on that enabling legislation. Of course, you still saw one of the Democrats in the House, Rashad Taylor, try to amend it even on the House floor the last day to leave out companies that would, private businesses that would go in and run these schools. And of course, the Speaker said that it was not germane to the bill.
Was anyone at this table surprised by how much oxygen this whole issue took out of the session?
Not at all, because obviously you've got an issue that's going to affect children and parents, and that's voters. Not children, but the parents are voters, and so they're very interested in this issue because they can see the direct effect that this legislation is going to have on their lives. Also, it ended up being a very divisive issue, in both chambers, especially between, your rural and your urban lawmakers. This was an issue, that most people saw charter schools as affecting, the Metro Atlanta area. This is not something that is really something that's going to affect schools statewide or school districts statewide. And so, there was a lot of discussion about why they should be taking this up amid other priorities this year.
And this comes on top of a season that we're just now ending, where we've been laying off teachers, we've been cutting the school year down, we've boosted class size. I mean, these school systems are stretched financially, and to them this was the feather that might break their backs.
And now the people decide in November. It's up on the November ballot, and hopefully everyone will understand the constitutional amendment once they write it and put it there, which could be a problem.
Well, we hope so.
And it's going to bring out some interesting constituencies that might have an impact on a presidential contest.
And this was heavily lobbied, at the Capitol. You can expect that lobbying effort to transfer to the campaign trail.
Tax reform has been a major initiative for the past several years under the Gold Dome. In 2010, legislation formed the Special Counsel for Tax Reform and Fairness and a Special Joint Committee on Revenue Structure. And after studying and consideration, various suggestions about reforming Georgia's tax and revenue system emerged. This year, the first of some of those suggestions took the form of legislation. And one of the things that generated an awful lot of controversy is the one that will directly affect local governments again, Jim Galloway, changing the way that you exact a fee on vehicle sales, the new title fee instead of the ad valorem tax.
Now, you got me on this one. I haven't been able to figure it out, and I don't know that many people have. But supposedly after next year, if you buy a car, then you're subject to a sales tax.
No, just
No
a title
sales
fee.
tax.
A title fee
At the
tax.
title office,
At
right.
the title office.
Yeah.
But then, if you don't buy a car, then you have to keep paying the property tax
Correct.
on your car until you do buy a car.
Yep.
So now, will that cause more people to run out and buy a car?
Well, I think up until it takes effect in March, and so I think that they wrote it in so that anyone who buys a vehicle from the time it's signed into law to March would have a choice. They could choose to go either way, if they buy a new vehicle or if they keep their old.
But an awful lot of county commissioners are worried that this is going to take money out of their pockets because that's cash flow. Ad valorem tax is cash flow every month for them.
But they were given a guarantee this time, and Clint Mueller with the Association of County Commissioners said last night to me that they are not concerned. There is still there's still some question out there, but they're taking the legislators on their word that they will get that guarantee from the state.
The cash flow is a big problem because these counties get their money. You pay your tax according to your birthday, so the money is always coming in. Now they don't know when they're going to get that substitute money.
Now, part two of the income tax of the tax reform package, reduction of the marriage penalty and freeze of retirement income exclusions. This sort of eats around the whole notion the tax council started with, Tom, that they wanted to find a way to reduce or eliminate Georgia's state income tax. Roger Tutterow was on that council and told us that.
That was the number one goal, to reduce the income tax for individuals and for businesses, and this bill really didn't do it. As you say, it raised the exemption for married couples, and that's really about it. It was, as I say, a big tax revision plan that was largely ignored when they actually got around to implementing it.
Another big portion of all this, I'm sorry you had a comment on that, another portion of this was the sales tax exemption on energy, and they said this will create an awful lot of jobs in Georgia. Errin?
Well, the thought being that other states have already have this exemption, making them more attractive than Georgia. If Georgia did this, we would be able to attract, more jobs as the economy is recovering. You get more, in our economic development arm becoming more aggressive, would be able to attract those businesses using that as part of their toolbox.
Anyone know of the first big business who will say, oh boy, let's come to Georgia and put some jobs in place? No, Caterpillar did. They were waiting on this.
Yeah, sure. Caterpillar said that they had accepted that property up in Athens on the presumption that this would pass.
As part of this package, yeah.
We hear there's two more.
We hear there's a couple more big ones coming out. Haven't heard what it is yet, but maybe the governor's office will be rolling those out in the next week or two.
Okay, and we'll watch how they implement internet sales taxes more aggressively as well. That'll be kind of fun to watch.
That'll be actually very interesting because most people don't know you're already supposed to be paying that internet state sales tax, but most people don't. You're supposed to file it on your income tax. If you don't pay it at
You're supposed to
the point of
voluntarily
sale.
do this.
Of course,
Everyone's going to do that.
It's on the consumer, and of course, we're all responsible doing that.
Criminal justice reform is another issue that's been in the works for a long time. Last night, the House agreed to a Senate amendment and approved a first step in reforming the judicial system, the goal to reduce Georgia's prison population and save the state millions of dollars. Jim, let's start with you on this. This is pretty wide-ranging. I mean, we're talking about a lot of parts of this.
This is a rejection of the Zell Miller legacy of 2 strikes and you're out. That was what, 1992, 94?
More like 94, 95,
94.
96.
And
right.
it just, it packed Georgia's prison system. We put more people behind bars than many countries.
But Sandra, let's remember that this isn't a free pass to go out and hurt somebody. I mean, if anything, the writer said, we are adamant that violent offender is going to be locked up.
That's right. And so what the bill does is it expands the alternative sentencing programs that are currently out there, the DUI programs, the drug courts that are out there, in an effort to put some rehabilitation in, give some incentive for these folks not to go out and reoffend again. And they did as well. They raised the threshold on some of your theft crimes. Shoplifting is actually one that they didn't touch, that threshold, but some of your other ones, they increased the counts for burglary. You actually have a second degree burglary now for a home that's not, for a dwelling that's not occupied, like a shed or a garage or something.
It's something that could be controversial, changing the way, Errin, they deal with drug offenders too.
Absolutely. I mean, and the thought is that if they deal with some more of these non-violent offenders, they can have more room for the violent offenders. To your point about the drug offenses, they have gone to a weight-based system, meaning that there would be somebody who has a small amount of drugs would not be in the same, sentencing range as somebody who would have a larger amount of drugs. The thought being, a user versus a dealer, for example, somebody who may have a substance abuse problem that they could treat. And identifying those people and trying to get them help as opposed to just locking them up, and that would be something that could contribute to their recidivism.
One of the goals the government had, Tom, was to save money, $1.1 billion to lock up people in Georgia now. Is this going to come close to helping in that department?
I think it can, because there are several thousand people in our prison system now who are basically on for drug using charges. And the hope behind this is that those people can be diverted into drug treatment programs and into drug courts rather than given a hard bed in a prison. So in that sense, I think they can save some money.
One interesting thing is you saw just before this bill got final passage, you saw some pushback among local governments who began to realize that, okay, if we're reducing the number of felonies in Georgia and making them misdemeanors, those criminals really become the responsibility of the local governments and thus the cost to local governments.
And juvenile justice reform, very quickly, Sandra, that's going to have to wait.
That's going to have to wait. And I think some of that pushback was coming from the local governments because it was going to cost too much. They didn't say they were necessarily opposed to it, but they just didn't have the money. The state didn't provide the money to fund that.
Especially because, one of the things that happened with criminal justice, there were some concerns raised about how some of these reforms could be paid for. The GBI in particular, wanted more wanted more scientists, for example, to test, drugs. They don't have enough people to do that. Prosecutors are going to need, more people to do their work based on these new guidelines. And so, once they got a signal from the governor that those things would be put into the budget, priorities like juvenile justice maybe couldn't make the final cut.
Attorney General Sam Olens told me this morning this is very much a work in progress when they figure out how to pay for everything that this thing calls for. Another measure that passed after a conference committee reached an agreement on sine die yesterday was the bill that makes assisting suicide a felony. The committee amended the bill to add more protections for the medical community.
There's an amendment you've got before you. It's a consensus amendment that restores much of the language we put in the HB 1114 in the House that is frankly more protective of the healthcare community than what was passed by Senate committee. It also takes away some attorneys' fees provisions that were problematic late in the process. This has the support of the Attorney General's office, law enforcement community, and the medical community.
You could say this is one of those social issues that did make it through Sandra Parrish. Assisted suicide or helping someone kill themselves, a felony now in Georgia.
Right, and that came out of a court case. You may remember that just in February, the Supreme Court threw out a case that involved a Forsyth County man who had brought in a network, the Final Exit Network, who had come in and helped him to commit suicide. And it was thrown out not necessarily on assisted suicide, them assisting him, but it was a free speech right because they were, I guess, advertising on the internet and it made it readily available. And you could not, under Georgia law that was passed in 1994, you couldn't advertise and then go show up and help do it. And so that was one of the reasons it was thrown out, just on free speech. So that's why Representative Ed Setzler said that this was needed to be able to go in and ban it completely.
Pushing ahead here on another issue, opponents said it was an effort to keep illegal immigrants out of Georgia's public colleges and universities. The measure would have defined higher education as a public benefit and therefore a benefit that only citizens or legal residents could enjoy. Tom Crawford, and that had the brakes put on it.
That had the brakes put on it in the House. It came out of the Senate very easily, but Speaker Ralston had said from the beginning he didn't really want to take up that issue again this year, and Governor Deal said much the same thing. The feeling being that we had passed the HB 87 immigration control last year. Let's let that one settle in and work for a while before we start taking the bite out of that apple again. And it basically got put in the drawer in the House and did not come out for a vote on the last night.
Yes.
I would say that it was actually Senator Barry Loudermilk, that took the aspect of the students off of that bill.
Yeah.
He's saying that the documentation parts of the bill were much more important, and I was really kind of surprised that that bill didn't make it up either. But we had Larry Pellegrini on last evening, who is an immigration activist, was saying that there was actually federal concern with the federal government over allowing documentation along with the foreign passport for identification. Apparently, when you cross into the border, they give you just a little 3x5 size piece of paper, just has a stamp on it that the person actually fills out. And then they said that requiring that along with those foreign passports just wasn't right.
I think some people were surprised because they took that piece out to try to save the rest of the bill, and then it just didn't happen.
We just call it the little things. Some of these fringe issues wound up taking a lot of time. The big stuff, like the budget, were silky smooth, Jim Galloway. I mean, things went well there.
This was great. Again, a little bit of it is because there's not that much money to argue about, but they did get their big issues done. Just the supplemental budget and the larger $19.3 billion budget. Man, those things just cruise. That was the official thing that the legislature needed to do. They could have adjourned last week.
You know, though, we should point out, though, that final budget included that $100 million that came from the mortgage fraud settlement.
Yes.
And that
Yes, it was.
Georgia was given $100 million to help the victims of mortgage fraud, and they ended up putting that as more of an economic development.
Yes.
Into building roads for
infrastructure
businesses and
instead of helping
infrastructure.
homeowners.
Right, and again, no raises for teachers, no raises for state employees.
But some more days for pre-K. That was something the
10 more
governor
days.
wanted.
Yes,
That's something the governor wanted. That certainly would have been very expensive. What do you attribute that to? Both the little budget and the big budget moving through quickly? Great management by Terry England and Jack Hill, or just the leadership getting together behind the scenes and hammering it in and saying, "Hey guys, you can fight about other things. You're not going to fight about this, Tom."
Well, there's a good relationship between the two committee chairmen, and as Jim mentioned, there's not a big pot of money to argue over, which makes it a lot easier.
Errin?
The same thing. They just didn't. The budget wasn't going to grow by very much. I mean, the governor's been very cautious about the state's recovery. We've had a steady growth, in revenue every month, but certainly not the windfall that says that we're back in business again here. So he's wanting to just be cautious about how we're spending here in the next couple of years.
All right, going around the table here once more here. The X factor here is the governor. Governor Nathan Deal, Jim Galloway has 40 days, 40 nights to make up his mind on some things.
Right, and you may see a few things there. The city of Brookhaven, I think, it may be on the bubble with him. He really has to go through line by line on a lot of this stuff. One thing that I will say that he's going to have to start rethinking, and we touched on it earlier, is this tax reform. When you do tax reform, you make choices and you push yourself in a direction, and it's hard to go in another one. Just before the session ended, in an interview, Governor Deal said it's going to be really, really hard to meet his promise to really attack and lower that state income tax now.
Some last words from you, Tom Crawford.
Well, the governor is also a lawyer. It will be interesting to see if he listens to the argument that some of these bills might be unconstitutional and decides, well, maybe I better veto that. We'll see.
And Errin Haines, the election landscape changes a little bit this fall. We see even fewer Democrats on cap.
Absolutely. I think you saw a session that was shorter than in recent years, and one of the reasons for that is because they were ready to hit the campaign trail immediately. And with redistricting just having happened this past summer, they've got a lot of new constituents to meet. And the Republicans, in drawing these maps that they drew last year, drew them in hopes of making some gains for their party.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave it. Thank you so much for all of you being here. Thanks for your hard work throughout the session, keeping the people informed. We always appreciate that. And that'll just about do it for our broadcast and the 2012 session. I'd like to thank our staff of professionals here at GPB for facilitating the production of a live legislative coverage program every night. And that's no small feat. And mostly, of course, the most important part is you, the public television viewer. It's your support and, yes, your eyes that make GPB television worth sharing. We couldn't produce Lawmakers without you. Don't forget, we have complete video archives of the 2012 session available at our website, gpb.org/lawmakers. There's also complete Lawmakers programs, plus extended interviews and much more. GPB is your home for complete Capitol coverage 24/7 at gpb.org/lawmakers. And while you're online, why don't you like us on Facebook? We'd like to be liked. Coming up next on GPB, Rick Steves' Europe. Tonight, Rick visits Basque Country, the historic region on the split between France and Spain. It's famous for its food and culture. Rick Steves takes you there next on GPB. And that's our broadcast for this post-Sine Die show. I'm Scott Slade. We'll see you next January. It's been great. Have a good night.
This is a GPB original production.